Can you tell me a little bit of something about who Donald Sterling is just as a human in LA in his history, never mind anything about the Clippers?
Well, I remember talking to one of the Clipper employees at the time, and he said, without the Clippers, Donald Sterling would have just been another rich guy in LA. He said, there's a lot of rich guys in LA, but the Clippers gave him a platform to be a celebrity, to be somebody, to be relevant in this town. And when you listen to the podcast and trace his journey all the way through, the thing that was so striking to me was this is a guy who was from Boyle Heights, from East LA. His dad was a peddler, like a junk peddler. He would get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and go down to the fruit markets and help him sell his wares. This should have been a rags to riches story, because Donald Sterling puts himself through law school. He builds his own real estate empire, and then he buys the Clippers. But instead, he ends up doing unto others what he had done unto him as when he was a child, which is divide the city through housing discrimination. Right. And you see a lot of the cases that came against him with the Justice Department. There's a funny line in there, and somebody says, "Do you know why we have rent control in Beverly Hills?" I said, "Yeah, because of the Sterlings." I mean, he would buy properties and raise the rents and slap a new coat of paint on it, and that's how he created an empire. And I think people know him as the owner of the Clippers, but he was one of the most powerful men in Los Angeles in terms of real estate and the way that our city has been divided up for the last 30 years.
Mark, I want to ask you this because, you hear a lot of wild stories about what it was like to play under him. Plenty of people have been in this league and covered it forever. Well, I mean, what was it like from what you heard to be a player on the Clippers? We heard from Blake Griffin here, but he owned that team for a long time.
Well, you heard the slave owner mentality. I definitely felt that from the players before. You heard stories about Sterling and his friends going into the locker room and while the players were showering and changing, and Sterling saying, look at these beautiful black bodies. I remember writing a story about Baron Davis getting heckled during the game by Sterling because Sterling didn't think he was playing to the level of his contract. I mean, that's absolutely nuts. But they weren't really around him a lot, but I think every time they were around him, afterwards, they felt like they need to go take a shower. Wow. They just felt like they were just around a really miserable, dirty person.
This is the question for the both of you. Momo, you can go first. What's it like to talk about the Clippers and Donald Sterling now in and around LA?
I mean, nobody wants to talk about Donald Sterling with the Clippers, right? Like they would prefer never to bring up his name because it's such a different franchise right now. And I think the guy who had the best story about this to me, I don't know, there's a few. Doc Rivers had a couple of really good ones, but Ralph Lawler, who was their longtime broadcaster, told me this story. There's an assistant coach, his name was Dave Wohl, and they once had a coaches meeting, and he just called him Donald. He just said, hey, he didn't say Mr. Sterling because Donald liked to, he always wanted everyone to call him Mr. Sterling, like as if that was a title. I mean, it's not like he's a professor or a doctor, but Mr. became a title for him. And the next year, Dave Wohl was no longer with the Clippers. Like, he was gone. And people used to joke about that. And Doc Rivers said something, he met with him, and he didn't call him Mr. Sterling either. And somebody said, hey, Doc, you know what happened to Dave when he did that? And Doc goes, you know what? I'll call him Mr. Sterling when he calls me Mr. Rivers.
Wow. Mark, what's it like to talk about Sterling and the Clippers?
I do wonder what would have been like today if that happened today. As I said in the podcast, I was really, really disappointed when the players didn't boycott, leaving it in the hands of Adam Silver to make a decision. That Game 3 was Game 3 or Game 4 was in Oakland, California, the home of the Black Panthers, where a lot of protesting and voices have been heard, and to just basically take off their jerseys and walk away, and it actually brought me to tears. I was so disappointed. You had the right audience. You had the Oakland audience. They certainly would have backed those guys up. But when I've talked to Doc about it, Blake, CP, DeAndre, it seems collectively that they believe that they made the right decision by playing.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For highlights and analysis, check out the ESPN app. And for live streaming and premium content, check out ESPN+.